So, the study was done to, again, give actionable items to leadership so that they could go into their newsroom and say, could we try this? Or what's the best way for us to take this idea and apply it to our newsroom? As Randy said earlier, we'd love for everybody to get a pay increase. We'd love for every newsroom to be able to hire 30% more staff to address some of the challenges that they're facing. That's not likely to happen. So we wanted to present a series of solutions that we felt were both realistic and realistic at many different types of newsrooms, meaning, this wouldn't be just something for big news organizations to try, but they could be tried by newsrooms that have only 5 or 6 people in them.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. On this 50th episode of the podcast, I talk with Randy Picht, Executive Director of the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism, and Andrew Finlayson, Executive Vice President of Digital and AI Strategies at SmithGeiger. Randy and Andrew led a major study on burnout and mental health in newsrooms, surveying more than 1,100 current and former journalists across all 50 states. We explored the findings of the report, including why 80% of journalists see burnout as a critical issue, how this is leading to significant attrition in the industry, and, most importantly, what solution newsroom leaders can implement to make real progress. From rethinking newsroom culture and workloads to prioritizing agency and work-life balance, this conversation is packed with actionable insights for building healthier, more sustainable workplaces in journalism. This is the first episode in a series on mental health in news organizations, an issue that is more critical than ever as challenges in the industry continue to mount. Next episode, I talk with Samantha Ragland at American Press Institute, where she's led efforts to address this issue at multiple levels. And we'll conclude the series with Dan Harris, who pivoted from a high-pressure career in broadcast journalism to become a full-time advocate for mental health and mindfulness. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Randy Picht and Andrew Finlayson. All right, well, welcome to the podcast, Randy and Andrew. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So earlier this year, you released the report on burnout, and I have several episodes coming out, in which this is the first, to really address burnout and mental health in the industry. And while the report's almost, 8 months old now, we haven't solved all the problems, so it's still timely. And in fact, one of the things you asked people about was sort of their projections, and disappointingly, there was a pretty broad consensus that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So this will still be a very relevant conversation. So Randy, why don't you start with who you are and why you commissioned this report?
So I'm Randy Picht. I'm the executive director of the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute here at the Missouri School of Journalism, a long title. And sometimes I don't get it right. But I've been here since 2012, so a dozen years. And before that, I worked for the Associated Press for 29 years. And I think the simple reason that we wanted to focus this survey on solutions to burnout is because we've been hearing, a lot of comments and encouragement to try to address the subject. Andrew from SmithGeiger came and had a great idea about how to do that, and it just seemed like the time was right and the approach was right, and so that's why we came up with this.
Andrew, introduce yourself and tell us why you thought this was something that needed doing.
Sure. So my name is Andrew Finlayson. I'm the Executive Vice President of Digital and AI Strategies at SmithGeiger. We're an international research and consulting company based out of Westlake Village in Southern California. We work with most of the major media companies in the United States and many newsrooms, mostly in the electronic space. I myself am a recovering journalist. I used to report. I worked in radio and television. I've worked at the local level and the network level. And to Randy's point, we're hearing from people almost every day about burnout. And it comes up in many different ways. People saying that they're having trouble filling positions, that they have positions that people have suddenly left, that good people, good experienced journalists are abandoning journalism, that there's a lot of people who have questions about whether or not companies can address burnout at this point because of resources and other challenges that they face.
Well, I just kind of want to bottom line the report. One of the things I appreciated was the design and the thoroughness and the approach. So you interviewed, I think, 1,140 participants in all 50 states, so a sizable survey. You had current and former journalists and newsroom leaders. You had some students and academics in there as well. So it's a pretty good cross-section across all media. And I think you had a variety of job roles in there as well, right? And, when Andrew, you sent us the survey last year to send out to our members, as you did to a lot of press associations and other groups. And I was interested to see it, but my sort of gut reaction as well, here's a survey that's going to tell us the obvious and point out all the problems and not really move us along. But you were very intentional in the survey to really look for solutions and to go deeper than just sort of a simple description of, everybody's burnout and here are a few simple reasons why. So talk a little bit about the mentality you were bringing to that and how you wanted to not just point out the problems.
Well, I think that, you said it. Many of us know that burnout is an issue throughout the industry. It's not new. Let's be frank about that. But there is some concern that it's intensifying. And so we wanted to establish a baseline, as it were, of where are we with burnout in the industry? What is the impact on the industry of burnout? In other words, establish the importance of this, because we knew that this study, if it was going to propose solutions, had to identify that this is a big enough problem that businesses and others needed to act on it. And then we put a lot of effort into actually looking into solutions to burnout. There's not a lot of work that's been done in that area specific to journalism. There's a lot of conversations, and there were some articles that spoke to what some organizations were trying. But frankly, there was precious little research that had been done around what are the active and possible solutions that could be implemented today or in the weeks to come in newsrooms of all different sizes. And so we surveyed, as it were, the industry, but we also went outside of journalism to talk with people that worked in medical, industries, in first responder type organizations, because they share some things in common with journalists. I'm not saying we have the exact same jobs or responsibilities. We don't hold people's lives in our hands like doctors and police officers do. But we have similar stresses and concerns and awkward shifts, to be frank. And so it was, a useful exercise in that we were able to find a lot of unique and interesting solutions that we felt had not been given a lot of attention inside of journalism. And we then put it in front of journalists. As you said, over 1,000. It's the largest study that we know of that's asked journalists about burnout. And then to specifically get at the issue of what do you think would actually solve this problem for you and your newsroom? And that's where the real value of this study lies.
And Randy, I wonder if you would talk about that from your perspective at RJI. One of the quotes in the report is yours early on, saying that just talking about it can be helpful, but you really did want to move towards solutions that newsrooms can enact and that we actually move the needle on the problem.
Yeah, I think that was an important part as we worked out the questions, and the focus was to try to zero in on things that a news director would have control of, or an editor, and make sure that the solutions that we were talking about were things that, had a chance to happen. Not like, well, if you double my salary, I won't be burned out. And, so we tried to make that point when, in the questions. And I think that's why we got some, like Andrew said, some interesting ideas about, well, this could help. And we don't see any reason why we couldn't try it. And that's what we wanted. We wanted as many ideas so we could say to the industry, this is coming from your people and this is what they think. So it's worth giving it a shot.
And, before we delve further into what you found, maybe let's just be explicit and set some of the ramifications if we don't address this. And you did address that in the report and kind of ended on that note. Why is this really important and not just a way to make you feel good about your management style and, make people feel good?
Well, I'm going to offer that, the study reinforced what, again, most of us suspected, and that is burnout is a leading concern in the industry and one that's accelerating. So clearly it's a crisis. We were able to give measurement to that level of crisis. 80% overall feeling burnout as a critical issue. As I said when I presented this research to news organizations, if any of your employees came to you and said, we've got a problem that's significant, that's affecting 80% of the people in our team, you would pay attention to it. And so we were able to figure out, again, what is that impact that we have? Most people in journalism know that they have been impacted by it, or they know people who have been impacted by it. So I think 9 out of 10 told us that they had a colleague that's been impacted by burnout. It's leading to people leaving the profession. 1 out of 5 active journalism professionals were actively planning on leaving because of burnout factors. Now, there was a study that was released today by Muckrake that said half of journalists are considering leaving. They have different numbers. They ask questions different ways. I don't think either one is right or wrong, but they pointed the finger towards the election. And certainly those pressures have intensified since this study was done almost a year ago. So again, it's having a direct impact on overall newsroom morale and staffing. 64% of former professionals, and we did talk to people who had left the industry, see burnout as having a dramatic impact on staffing and newsroom morale. So we felt it was important not just to talk to active journalists, but also people who had left, because we felt they had something to teach us. And what they had to teach us was that we better pay attention to burnout, because many of them did leave because of that factor.
I love that aspect of the report. In fact, I've thought about doing a podcast series where I talk to people who've left and just kind of delve into that. And whether the number's 1 in 5 or 50%, either one of those numbers is a shocking number. And one of the things your report also mentions in there is we're not just losing total bodies, we're losing experience, and we're also losing young talent, kind of on both ends of the spectrum, and that does not bode well for our industry.
Well, that's actually shocking. And Randy, I think you can speak to this because you work directly with students. But I travel around the country speaking at conferences, and at times they ask me to speak to young people who are either seniors or juniors in journalism or broadcasting. I'm hearing about burnout from these students. And I think it's because the job has changed so much. They're aware that there's increased public scrutiny and criticism, and frankly, a polarized environment that journalists are entering. And they're feeling it already in school. And then just the job's gotten more complex. You have to be a good person in, the ways that journalism has always asked you to be, but it's also now asking that you have certain technical skills and that you also can do social media and that you can manage crises, because we're all in that environment right now where anything we write will be criticized, as it should, but now it's taken on a particular edge that I think we'd agree is the worst that we've ever seen.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of this is that, preparing the students, preparing the folks that want to go do this job for what they're going to find, because it's prevalent, and being prepared and maybe having some tactics to deal with it or to have a better understanding of kind of what could happen that is very important. And we'll probably get to this later in the podcast, but it's something that this study, among other things, has helped us kind of take the next step in some of these issues, things that we learned. Some of it we already kind of knew, and this was just a little nudge to do more.
So let's delve into some of the key findings, and I'll just throw some out, and you can certainly add more as we go through this list. One of the striking findings that I came away with, and part of it's because, I'm dealing with a lot of newsroom leaders, and I'm dealing with, across the country. And on this podcast, I always ask guests if they're more or less optimistic, and almost universally it's more. And that some of that's selection bias and the types of people I'm talking to and what they're doing. But you found a remarkable degree of pessimism, and there was a split between newsroom managers and the front line. I've got the number here. 56% of active journalists are mostly pessimistic, rising to 83% among former journalists and former managers, with only 36% of active managers being mostly pessimistic. That's quite a divide, but also just a depressing top-line number of the amount of people who are pessimistic.
Well, and I think that we saw a bump with the managers, as you said. Part of it is because I think that they not only deal with editorial complexities, but they're also actively managing some of the revenue issues, the resources that we have to all manage these days closely. We always had to be careful, but now we're on a knife's edge as to what we can spend and how we should spend it. And they're, of course, having to, in some cases, make layoffs decisions. And that's an emotional burden that is shared amongst everybody in the newsroom. We all feel a layoff when it happens, but it's certainly felt in certain ways by newsroom leaders who have to make those decisions. So I think that burnout, is part of a complex sort of stew of issues that are facing newsrooms right now. But our argument is that if we don't do something to address burnout, we're going to lose good people and we're going to not be able to replace them.
Especially if we feel like it's within our reach. And that's what we tried to really get to the bottom of.
And I wonder, in terms of that top line number of who's felt burnouts personally, did you break that up? Did you analyze the data, the difference between the managers and the frontline employees?
Well, we do have it sliced in many different ways, and that's one of the things that we still can do with this research is to look at it more closely through the lens. For example, we did not do men versus women. We had a good representation of both. I think it was, about 50-50 on who responded to this survey. But we've got ways that we can go deeper into it. We did not do ethnicity in any great detail. And I have some concerns that people of color in newsrooms might be feeling stress in different ways. I'm not saying better or worse, but I think there are some reasons to think about that as part of what we're dealing with as we go forward. We did not necessarily do a lot of work around the age groups, and I think that there's a breakout that could be done about that. But what we did identify were managers because we felt like they would identify as managers, as people who lead. That was the question, basically. And they have concerns that are different from the frontline employees. And so I worry about the middle managers burning out, those people who are new to leadership roles. Again, they have a lot to deal with these days. And we're forcing some people into leadership positions who have not been properly prepared, to be frank. They either don't have a good mentor system in place, or they were suddenly forced to take on a job because somebody else quit, or they had a reorg of their newsroom structure. So, we're adding leadership challenges on top of everything else. And that's one of the concerns I have, is that if you're not a well-prepared leader, you may contribute to burnout, and you yourself may burn out.
Yeah, and that's kind of an unintended consequence of burnout, is that somebody gets promoted that has, is not in a position to succeed, and it's all because of burnout. I think, and also Andrew was talking about slicing and dicing the data, and Tim, you were asking a question about that. I mean, there's a ton of results in here that could be sliced and diced, and we have talked to some other researchers that are looking at doing that slicing and dicing, if you will. And this kind of a spoiler alert here in terms of what we are doing next is we have a couple graduate students that are looking at the difference between responses from women versus men. We're looking at the ethnicity issue. And we're also going to do one just focusing on TV newsrooms because they have some unique challenges. So that's in the works and probably going to come out in the next couple of months.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing some of that further research based on this. And I would encourage some researchers to look at that, the sort of the burnout across the different levels of the organization. Because, we tend to think of it in terms of frontline, and that is, I think our biggest concern for the most part. But those middle managers, do get burnout. And the executives, the C-suite, the founder and CEO of Community Impact, that's just a chain of newspapers in Texas and beyond, posted on LinkedIn right before I interviewed him about CEO burnout just in general. He had found an article, and it's something we don't talk about. And we certainly can't afford to lose frontline journalists, but we also can't afford to lose some of our best leaders who are out there, doing something different and innovative and trying to tackle the biggest problems. So some other things that came out of the report, based on the feedback, what journalists were saying, it's getting increasingly difficult. The lack of trust that reporters feel from, the community and readers at large is a big problem, and some of that goes to the political polarization as well. And then, you have the obvious, which we mentioned earlier, budget cuts, reduced staff, you're asked to do more with less, the experience that's walking out the door. And I think it's interesting and good that reporters are recognizing what they've lost when their colleagues leave. And social media. And I don't think, did you delve into what it was about social media that was causing people heartache?
Well, I'm going to, jump on that one. Prior to this job title, I was an EVP of social media because it was such an important part of helping newsrooms adapt to the new environment. I'm sure you're aware that for many people, social media is their news source. And so if we're not fully active and present in that environment, it will be surrendered to those who have other motivations to be in those platforms. And disinformation, misinformation, as we know, is a big cause for concern there. And what I wanted to do was just get that into the study because I felt like that's a place where people are exposed to some of the animosity of some people in the audience and some of the polarization that's going on. We didn't dive deeply into it. It's a whole nother study. I truly believe that. But the fact that 62% of broadcast journalists and, 61% of the total, meaning all the different types of people who participated in this survey, felt that that was one of the factors contributing to burnout, tells you a lot about how that particular issue, being in social media, using social media to share the good work that you and your team are doing, can be a cause for, a lot of concern and ultimately burnout.
Yeah, and I agree. That would be a rich vein for further research. Another place of further research that you allude to in the report, I think it was close to half of the respondents said it's becoming more dangerous. And you acknowledge in the report, and I think this was an important nuance, and I was glad to see it there. You're not sure if do they personally feel in danger, or is it globally they're sensing more danger, in other, or maybe even in other areas.
Well, I'll just offer that, I know people may be listening to this podcast far into the future, but this was taped shortly before the national elections here in the United States. I have spent a significant amount of time over the last several weeks. Actually, it goes further back than that, but it's become concentrated in doing security briefings and discussions around the threats that newsrooms and reporters may face on site covering this election. We have to, in effect, have the same protocols, the same thoughtful measures in place to protect our people and to protect our buildings, our newsrooms, as polling centers have to have these days. I'm not saying that we need to erect concrete barriers outside of our buildings like we've seen at some polling and election centers around the United States, but we better be thoughtful about it because every time you go to certain political rallies, the focus is on the fake media / the enemy of the people kind of language, which ultimately, of course, fuels an environment of distrust, but more concerning is the threats that actually materialize and turn into action. We don't know what's going to happen with this election, but I've told my clients to basically lock down and be ready to go for several days in a row if you need to, treating it almost like a hurricane in the sense of being self-sufficient just to get us through it. I hope none of that is necessary. I just feel it's prudent because I want everybody to come home from covering this story.
And Tim, one of that finding is one that I also was surprised by, and so I often mention it to folks when we were talking about the survey to news directors or editors or something, and often they have a personal story or something that their newsroom had to deal with about somebody getting hit with a rock or being threatened with violence. And I think to some extent that's an issue that we don't even know how bad it is because people don't regularly talk about it because we're journalists, we can put up with everything. So anyway, I think that was a finding that I did not expect. So,
yeah, and like you said, we don't talk about it. We don't like to be part of the story, but we've had, a newsroom shooting in Maryland not that long ago. We've had a sports photographer accosted at a football game and called the enemy of the people. We've had, we've arranged here in Colorado meetings with the attorney general and trainings, like you were talking about, Andrew, to help them deal with threats they were getting and, from militias and also just crazed individuals. And it's not going in the right direction. So, and we're not an industry flush with cash to have a lot of security measures either. So yeah, I think there's a definite warning sign there. Despite all of that, you also found that journalists remained enthusiastic about the value and the purpose of their work and passionate about their work and even feeling accomplished professionally. Did you get any nuance from the conversations you had or the survey about what it was that gave them that sense of accomplishment and that passion? What were the things they were hanging their hat on?
Well, I think what sustains journalism and has for a long, long time is the sense of purpose that you have. You are able to cope with a lot, the stress, the hours, frankly, in some cases, the low pay, because you believe in what you're doing. And this survey reinforced that journalists know and understand they are a vital part of a democracy. They said they were essential to a functioning democracy, and I certainly believe that they were proud of their work, that many of them felt it was a noble calling. How many people get to say that about the work that they do each day? All work is dignified. I want to be clear on that. I have shoveled ditches for a living at one point. But the work that we do does help others to navigate an increasingly complex world. And so, when you've got 67% saying, I love what I do, that helps you get through the tough times. There's no question about it. But at the same time, the survey found a significant number of people who said, I don't know why anyone would want to be a journalist today. So it's not like we're wearing rose-colored glasses. We see with clear eyes the good work that we do, the need for that work. But we also understand that the world is changing and that the next generation may have an even more challenging challenge ahead of them as we go forward.
I guess it's just hard to wrap your head around, like some of the other findings, like 97% said, I'm proud of my work. 93% said journalism is a noble calling, right? But then 72% said things have never been worse for journalists. So it's like, they really want to be there, but then they really don't know how they can be there. And that was kind of one of the frustrating findings I think we had.
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few eye-opening stats like that. Another one was, a majority, 51%, say they wake up each day wondering if they can get through the day. Another majority, 55%, totally agree with wonder why anyone would want to be a journalist. Over half would leave if they could. those are quite striking contrast. And another, in kind of the other direction, is that 3/4 felt that to various degrees their company is very supportive, and 8 out of 10 said to various degrees their community is supportive. So it's not that they're in these totally toxic communities and totally toxic work environments. It's the outliers that are causing them really heartbreak. And I think in terms of the newsroom environment, that's a positive sign, because there are tweaks we can do, right, to address some of this. It's not like the whole thing has to be torn down and rebuilt because it's so toxic.
We can't lose sight of the fact that we have a good foundation. Like Andrew said, the reason, the sense of purpose, the importance of the work is there, and it came through in the survey. And so that's a good place to start, I think, right, Andrew?
And that's the thing, is that, there were lots of measures in this that said, there are things that help people, in effect, navigate all the stress that they're facing. We ask a question about positive emotions. So most of the people felt passionate about their work at some point in the last, so many days. Accomplished, excited, happy, engaged, hopeful, trusted, encouraged, satisfied, and valued. Now, those offset some of the negative ones that this survey identified: stressed, mentally exhausted, tired, drained, overwhelmed, underappreciated, physically exhausted, pressured, intellectually exhausted. Those are things that will wear people down over time. And that's, of course, what leads to burnout. So, if we can do something to make it less stressful, we will, in fact, help immunize people against the corrosive effects of burnout, because burnout isn't a binary. It's got shades of gray all the way along. Some people handle it better than others. Some people burn out and can come back from it. Other people burn out and they never come back from it. I think if we can, with this podcast, help a few managers keep their staff from burning out, the whole podcast would have been worthwhile, because that's what we're facing right now. So we either do something to make it better, or it's going to continue to get worse.
You, as I recall, you presented 10 broad categories for the respondents to rate in terms of what they would like to see to help with burnout. And then you delved into specifics to get a lot more nuance. And you pulled out 5 that rose to the top. Can you talk through those 5 areas?
Sure. So, the study was done to, again, give actionable items to leadership so that they could go into their newsroom and say, could we try this? Or what's the best way for us to take this idea and apply it to our newsroom? As Randy said earlier, we'd love for everybody to get a pay increase. We'd love for every newsroom to be able to hire 30% more staff to address some of the challenges that they're facing. That's not likely to happen. So we wanted to present a series of solutions that we felt were both realistic and realistic at many different types of newsrooms, meaning, this wouldn't be just something for big news organizations to try, but they could be tried by newsrooms that have only 5 or 6 people in them. So we gave the audience, as it were, the people that took this survey, a range of options, 10 of them. They had to pick and choose which ones they thought were the most interesting and relevant to them. We couldn't ask everybody about every solution for all 10 of these buckets. People had to pick and choose. And the reason why I mention that is that there are some very important ideas in the bottom 5 that we discovered that are as important as anything in the top 5. It's just that more people chose some of these items in the top 5, which are work hours and flexibility options. And we can go deeper into that. But there's a big opportunity for newsrooms to rethink what is the job, meaning, is it a straight 8, or are there some flexible options there? Is it in the building, or is it something they can do a hybrid on? We've got some realistic and, in effect, approved solutions for newsrooms to think about. There was a healthy dose of interest in coverage and story responsibilities and workloads. In other words, how stories were assigned and who got assigned to them and how those stories were handled can have a big impact on people's feelings about burnout. Changes in newsroom culture. It shouldn't surprise anybody that the word culture showed up. I think it has a lot to do with burnout. I had one newsroom leader who runs a lot of newsrooms tell me, I have one newsroom that's this size and one newsroom that's almost exactly the same size, And burnout's a huge issue in this one newsroom, and it all comes down to the culture. That at the other place, they had a healthier culture that in effect was implementing some of the ideas that we were suggesting already. Time off and vacation time options was a big deal. I think journalists are bad about taking vacation. I know I was. And making sure that when they are off, they are truly off so they get that recovery time. We've got some solutions there that we can run by you guys. And then added or new employment benefits. Some of those do cost money, there's no question. But some of them actually are just making sure employees are taking advantage of existing benefits. And that's not always the case, in part because we don't communicate them fully. And so again, there's a list of those that were of interest to the people that took the survey. And that was what mattered. It wasn't management getting to decide this. It was 1,000 journalists getting to weigh in on they thought these things would help them.
Great. And, one of the things that you mentioned is sort of a theme that runs across the solutions that the respondents were picking was agency. And that's one of the things I was playing around with Notebook LM to see what its new podcast feature. And that's one of the things it picked out of the report and really leaned into was that sense of agencies that people want and need to fill. Can you elaborate on just that as kind of an overarching thing that came out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that wasn't that surprising, actually, that people want to be able to have more control over their lives, but also have, a say in what is, how the newsroom is working. And I think that comes through in like the top three areas in terms of scheduling, in terms of how the newsroom's going to operate, or am I going to get called in when I'm supposed to be off, that kind of stuff. And I think that is also something that is, within reach, that is not going to break the budget or, be some big deal. It could just be, and potentially would have a big impact if a little bit more agency was given.
Yeah, and I really respected Randy when he saw these results. That's a word that he immediately applied to a lot of what we learned. I think it's classic good management theory that if you're going to empower your employees, they are in fact going to be better employees. They'll feel more responsible for their duties and that they'll take more on that they personally feel that they can control. So it's not exclusive to broadcasting. It's not exclusive to journalism that would be a critical issue. I think what we're finding, though, is that newsrooms are running so lean these days and have so many demands on the people that remain that some of that capability of making decisions is being squeezed out. And so it's going to take some, serious management skills to be able to give your managers time to be able to talk to your staff about these kinds of issues and then, be able to actually follow through. Nobody wants lip service. They want to see actually, hey, you're listening to me. And I think that would go a long way towards addressing some of these challenges that we're facing.
And the other thing I'll say is that I think one of the legacies of COVID is that there was a lot of agency needed when we were in the throes of that and newsrooms were locked and people had to figure out how to get the job done, and be creative, and they didn't have the same tools they needed, or they needed to, set up a green screen at home or whatever. A lot of that was on individual folks that came up with, how to get the job done. And I think that is something that folks don't want to have to, throw that out the window. It taught us something, and we need to learn from it.
Yeah, and as you said, I also didn't find it surprising, but I thought it was a really useful note. Anybody who studied psychology or organizational behavior, that's a key thing. But in the heat of deadlines and crises and shrinking newsrooms, it's easy to forget and just focus on getting the job done. And I think it's even more important, as you say, in light of COVID, because people have gotten a taste of remote work and all of these other factors of work life that do provide a little more agency. And organizations that I think are trying to put that genie back into the bottle, maybe shooting themselves in the foot. Talk a little bit about, this is not in the report, but it's the implication of the report. So how do you organizations really implement some of these recommendations or suggestions or ideas around work and coverage in a 24/7 cycle? We've got how do you do a 4-day work week in a 24/7 news cycle? Do you have any thoughts on practically implementing that, particularly in small newsrooms?
Yeah, so that, that's another spoiler alert, is that we are hoping in the spring to have kind of a symposium or workshop with some of the, I'm calling them the Coalition of the Curious, some TV newsrooms that would like to learn more and hopefully give this a try. And in putting that together, I'm learning that there are resources out there one of the things that we've heard is that won't work in the newsroom because we are 24/7, 365 days. We don't have the ability to just say, oh, we don't need anybody here or that kind of thing. And there's a consultancy that is devoted to 4-day work weeks. He told me, well, that's what they said at the hospital. And that's what the police captain told me. It's not going to work here, but they have made it work. And so I think that's one of the things that, that I bring into the conversation, is that you're not the only ones that have to deal with that kind of time pressure. And also, I think, it may involve some compromises. So you have to kind of be open to that and really understand the value you're bringing, at different times, to see if that you can make a few changes and have it work.
Yeah, I think that example from those examples from other industries is really super important, and I would love to see more detail, probably do more research on that, even because, as you say, there are other institutions, other businesses, industries that have a lot of the same pressures, and to some extent even more so. I mean, we think what we do is weighty and important, and it is, but we don't literally hold a life in our hands like a doctor in an operating table. And they've had to deal with a lot of these issues, and in fact, even medical schools and medical interns that fairly recently have had a reform around that, because they were working them to death practically. And I think there were some court rulings, or maybe some Department of Labor rulings, where they weren't allowed to do that, and they've learned to adjust. And I think to some extent that's what we're going to have to do in the industry. And this might be a good segue to some of the detail that comes out of those areas, because once people pick their top areas, you started asking for more details on how they might be able to, what they would like to see, what does it mean to actually have better working conditions, better work-life balance, that sort of thing. And in regards to, the question about just making it work, one of the things I was happy to see come through there is journalists wanted help identifying what their priorities should be, basically a stop doing list, because we have a tendency to, hey, now you've got to do TikTok videos in addition to tweets and all of these other things, and your beat's expanding, and we hardly ever prioritize it for them and then say, let's just cut this out and stop doing this.
Yeah, that was in that, we had the coverage and story responsibilities, and that was the number one response, was regularly evaluating workloads of journalists in different teams. So, understanding maybe this is not as important. Maybe we don't have to do this anymore, or maybe we can do it a different way. And the way to do that is to constantly be looking at it and thinking about it. So that was the number one response. I think allowing employees to have more input, again, agency on how work gets done. So there was a sense, I think, from the findings that that's not happening. And that's another thing, doesn't require any money or, anything like that. It just, communication is a beautiful thing.
I encourage people to read the report. There are a lot of these ideas that are thrown out there, and I'm really interested into the further work that's going on. And as you delve into, more examples and experiments, even that can work in a variety of sizes of newsrooms, of those specifics that the survey respondents were giving you, were there any that surprised you or really stood out as maybe more important than you would have thought?
Well, I thought that, the answer I gave earlier about vacation time is encouraging employees to use all their vacation time. That literally costs no money. But reinforcing that work-life balance is incredibly important. So just the simple things we can do to make sure that off time is truly off. I know that many journalists see themselves almost in a clerical type of role, meaning, they put the collar on and they wear it 24 hours a day. They're always thinking of every conversation as possibly a story lead, and they're always listening for the police sirens in the distance. Those are all things that I think are virtues, because it does help you find stories. It does help you know what's going on in your community. But we have to be able to give people downtime. And I do the analogy, and I did this when I was presenting this research to a group of journalists. I said, imagine yourself like a rubber band, and I held up a rubber band and I stretched it. And I said, you can stretch pretty far. Look at how far I'm stretching. But if I keep stretching you this far over and over again, what's going to happen? And they all said, you're going to snap. Well, that's literally the case, is that, burnout's not just something that suddenly happens, but it builds and builds and builds until something breaks. And I'd like for people to, reinforce and enforce weekends off, because we've got to give people that time to recover from some of the work that they do Monday through Friday or whatever their shift is.
And I guess the one that surprised me, so if we take the three general areas, newsroom culture, changing in schedules, and coverage and responsibilities, there were maybe, there were like 40 different choices or something like that among those three areas. And the one that got the lowest number of all of them was weekly prizes for the best story that week. Like by a lot too. Like people do not like that. Like nobody should do that. If anybody's doing that that's listening, stop immediately, because it was way down on the list. And I think Andrew said when we talked about this, when we saw that, he's like, "Oh, I used to do that. I used to do that."
And I confess, I did. I had back in the day, I had a desk drawer that had, American Express gift certificates. And I would hand them out on a weekly basis for work that we thought best represented what our newsroom was trying to accomplish. I thought I was highlighting and celebrating. Well, it turns out I was depressing and annoying.
But it seems like such a good idea, Andrew.
I know. Well, I'm glad I don't do it anymore, but I did it for years. So that may not, by the way, be the case, but I hear of lots of internal competitions and awards. I don't think we should stop recognizing good work. I just think that incentive and sort of you win, but you don't, even though you probably worked as hard as that person, that does actually hurt your overall morale. And as we know, morale is part of the large matrix of what causes burnout.
And what did come through related to that is, while people don't like that competition aspect, they do want regular feedback on what they're doing well and maybe where they can improve. They want professional development and they want some praise, because as anybody who's been a manager knows, at least this has been my experience and I've seen it lots, it can be really hard to slow down and just tell people they're doing a great job or a good job. and here's an area where you can improve. A yearly performance report doesn't cut it.
No. And I'll confess again, because, my personal experience did help shape some of this, that I had a very good boss who called me into the office one day when I was a new manager and said, "You're not doing enough to praise your team and be specific about that praise." And I said, "I do it all the time." And they said, "You think you do it all the time. I want you to keep track of it, and it has to be timely and specific. It can't just be at the end of the week, you did a great job, go home. It had to be in the moment to recognize something that we thought was important. It was a lot of work. It kept me after my normal hours, just trying to make sure I could say I did the 10. But the point wasn't the 10. The point was to be thoughtful and constantly aware of that need to give strong feedback, both good and bad, by the way. I found that people welcomed sort of the corrections or at least insights as to what we could do better. And that's, again, part of this larger conversation that we have about, does middle management have the time even to do that anymore?
Yeah, and I think some of it also, that it's a good illustration of, the next step here in terms of the tactics of how you make this work. So the lowest was weekly prizes. So the competition aspect, saying you're the best and the rest of you, like from Glengarry Rose with the steak knives, that kind of thing. But the number one suggestion in changes to newsroom culture: recognize and acknowledge the valuable work of employees more. You got to think about how to do it the right way, because somebody could say, okay, well, we're going to recognize and acknowledge by having a competition and defeats the whole purpose. So that's some of, how these findings work their way into the newsroom is going to be important as well.
As you indicated there, giving good feedback is an art and takes some training. I would recommend Radical Candor by Kim Scott for any managers wanting to do a better job. And she mentioned some of those same things you mentioned, Andrew, about being timely and specific and not just have a generic general praise or generic criticism. So, and one last thing I'll circle back to is, being able to really turn off at work can be really difficult, even if you actually do take that vacation and not ruminate and worry. And so I think mindfulness, we're starting to see some increasing emphasis on that in some circles. In fact, I have Dan Harris, who's left journalism and is doing a mindfulness business and podcast. I have him coming on the podcast soon. But I think those aspects are also important, and you can't dictate that, but you can certainly facilitate or open up those options. Is there, before we go to the rapid fire questions, is there anything else in the report that I didn't ask about or that you want to highlight?
Well, I'll just offer that, there is a breakout that can be done by ages, as there, can be with any research. I'm hearing firsthand that managers who work with the newest generation of journalists are seeing very different attitudes. They are more focused on work-life balance, that maybe they are better at turning off. And the challenge that I see is that for some newsroom leaders, they grew up in what I call the toughen up buttercup era of journalism, that if you couldn't take it, get out. Because we only have room for those people who can suffer the slings and arrows and so forth. That's not helpful. It's not helpful in general, but it's certainly not going to work with many of the people that are entering the industry. In some cases, who saw their parents put endless hours into work and maybe not get the satisfaction or the happiness back that they thought. I had one young newsroom employee be very pointed with me. They said to me words to the effect, I work to live. I don't live to work. You have to understand the difference, Andrew. And that was like, gotcha. I totally understand. I'm a little more passionate, a little more 24/7, but I respect what you just said. And that's going to be an important shift as we go forward, is how do we work with and for the next generation of journalists?
I don't know, Tim, if you want to, before we do the rapid ones, kind of what we're going to do going forward is three main things. I mentioned the research that kind of has taken a deeper dive into this, so that's going to come out in the next few months. And also, any researchers that are listening, if they want access to the data, just they can email me and we can send them the whole shooting match, And the other thing is we're going to have that workshop in the spring to try to get some more TV newsrooms to give this a try. There are some stations that are already doing it, and they can come and talk about how to do it. And so looking forward to that. And that's probably going to be in March. So again, if anybody's interested in that. And then the third thing is we're putting together a learning module for college journalism classes that we'll share for any schools that want to have a class or a couple classes about burnout and kind of what is going on and what we found and some solutions for them to think about as they enter the workforce.
Great. That's very helpful. And I'm curious, before we do move into that rapid fire questions, from your perspective, seeing Mizzou students come through, are you seeing what Andrew was referring to? And is there anything else that we should think about as leaders about the younger generation of journalists and would-be journalists?
Getting them to understand that this is an issue. I think too many of our students find out, a year in or 2 years in, and that's something we can avoid, and we should not just kind of do the we're tough, we don't talk about it. And here at Mizzou, there's a lot of demands on them, so they end up having some of these issues a little bit earlier. And so we do get to have some conversations with them. So we kind of feel like they get a little bit more of a sense of what's ahead. But I think we just have to be more purposeful in terms of including that in their education.
Yeah. And I think newsroom leaders need to feel a particular responsibility when they do get a young journalist in, whether it's someone just out of, undergrad, grad school, or a Report for America fellow, that they're not inviting them into a toxic situation that's going to cause them to just leave the industry. When I was at the Center for Collaborative Journalism, we were trying to do the teaching hospital model and putting students in newsrooms. And one of the concerns we had was that we don't want to drive them out of the industry by putting them into a bad situation. And so leaders, I think, need to feel a special responsibility when they get talented young journalists to make sure that they're getting that care and feeding and not burning out and not suffering, racism or all the other problems that can happen in an unhealthy environment.
Yeah, and I think and as we're putting together the education module, there's going to be a slide or two about things you should find out about the organization you're interviewing with and questions you should ask during the interview, because that's one way to find out what you're getting yourself into, right? And that's perfectly fine. So,
yeah. And now for those rapid fire questions. So compared to a year ago, and this is more really about the trajectory than the specifics of a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
I would say I'm more optimistic. I think there's a lot of energy and a lot of new things happening, and it's great to see.
And I'll be a little more pessimistic. I'll just offer that the business of journalism, meaning, the support that we need, the fuel, as I call it, to commit great acts of journalism, is going to be more and more challenging going forward. The local advertising environment will be its own set of challenges, but simply we've got far more competitors. And one of those we should talk about is the flood of AI slop that's going to, in effect, take people's attention away from meaningful local and national journalism.
Which leads me actually to the second question. Does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
I feel like there's going to be a pattern here. Andrew, why don't you go first?
Well, I've been involved in AI for over 15 years. It was the focus of a fellowship that I did at Stanford. So I always tell people AI is not new. It's just getting a lot of new attention. That the big point, though, that I try and make is that this is a transformative technology. And like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. I was on the phone yesterday with a company in Israel that can create local newscasts with no humans involved. As they said, we can just have one person select the stories. The machine will generate everything else, the story, the avatar, the actual newscast itself. That sounds like science fiction. It's not. It's already available. It's happening. So What does that mean? Well, in the hands of people who care about truth and good local coverage, maybe it augments or supports meaningful journalism that's already being done. Or is it used to replace and basically serve political and business purposes that are not in the community's best interest? That is something we will see over the next, not 6 months, but probably over the next couple of years.
Yeah. And so I would say, in terms of, do I have hope or do I have dread? I would say it depends on the day. And I guess I want to be hopeful, but it's also something that, like Andrew said, is a concern, and we need to know a lot more before we really understand what's going to happen.
Do you have a favorite piece of advice you've received or you like to give?
Well, the thing that got me into this business wasn't a piece of advice, but it was a short story. It was a local reporter came to our high school on one of those career day kind of events. And he said to the gathered students, journalism is the most fun you can have with your clothes on. And, for a young person who is trying to decide what do you do with your life, I thought the idea of learning every day for the rest of my life and getting paid for it sounded like a pretty good job option. And I'm so glad I did, because I immediately went and worked on the high school newspaper, and that led to me being the editor, which has led to 45 plus years in what I consider to be one of the most exciting things you can do with your life. And that's journalism.
Yeah, that's great. I guess mine is take the best and leave the rest. And also, I guess if you'd let me have two, there's no such thing as a dumb question. Two pieces of advice that were very helpful in terms of, feeling confident in terms of what I was going to be doing.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that drives you crazy in its wrongness or oversimplification?
Well, my concern is that journalists often feel that their job ends when they publish. And, they put all the effort into creating the story. Journalism has changed. The world has changed. And journalists have to understand the role they play in getting that story to the audiences that need to see it. And without that, we're just talking to ourselves. Now, some good journalism spreads by itself because it's so powerful, but I would argue that most good stories still need a helping hand from that journalist and from their colleagues to get it to the right audiences, so we have the impact that we all want to create with our work.
I would say the conventional wisdom that is wrong, in my opinion, is change is hard. Talking about change, worrying about change, but often change is not that hard. And we generally think of change that's bad as this is horrible, this is very hard, but change that's good happens overnight sometimes. So I'm not a change is hard kind of guy.
Failure's a part of life. Sometimes it's a really important part of learning and also just putting you on a different path, but we don't talk about it that much. Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
Well, the obvious answer is I have many. So we could spend the next couple hours on that. But there's one story I actually told this week to somebody. They called me asking for advice. They're in journalism, and they felt like their business was not taking them as seriously as they could, or not giving them the opportunities. And I said, well, that may mean you have to expand your horizons. Everybody needs to sometimes change their jobs. It's better that you change your job than somebody tries to, force you to make that decision. And I said, what you want to do is you want to be seen as that person who's ready for the next big position. So the failure story I told them was I'd just been hired by a very large multinational company. I was 6 months into the job. I hadn't really established myself yet, but a job opened in New York that I thought was interesting. And I applied for it. I went to my boss and said, I know I've only been here 6 months, but I think it's a job that I would be good at. And thankfully, my boss said, go for it. If nothing else, you'll learn something. And that's exactly it. I didn't get the job, but I learned a lot. And I was then available for a future job that happened 2 years down the line that was what I was hoping for. So I failed, but I learned a lot, and I gave myself an opportunity down the line. If you don't take that risk, you will not learn.
Yeah, that's good. I like that one. Maybe this doesn't qualify, but it is kind of a failure, I guess. But So when I got the job as the business editor for the AP in New York, I went and we were living in Kansas City. So I went and spent a week in New York, introduced myself, got started. And on Friday was going to go home and I had to go to the airport. And the managing editor had said, well, before you go, send everybody an email to say, it was nice meeting, to kind of wrap things up and get off on the right foot. So I was kind of late and I realized I could not do it because I didn't have everybody's email address in the department, so I was like, I'm not going to be able to do this. This is like a failure, right? So I walked around and just said goodbye to everybody, like old school, because it didn't take that much longer. And then I left, but then people talked about that for a long time. That you really are a great leader because you took the time to come by my desk and say goodbye, and and so it worked out.
Very relevant to what we've been talking about. What is something you do to restore yourself and maintain your sanity personally?
Well, I play tennis. I was going to say I play golf, but that actually does not bring me sanity. So I have to pick going out on the tennis court and being able to kind of release everything by hitting a ball.
And the greatest blessing I have beyond my family and my faith is that I have the opportunity to often travel as part of work. And for me, all travel, even difficult travel, is restorative in the sense that it gives me new perspectives. It introduces me to new people. I see things that I never would have thought of, and I understand a little bit more about this world. And I've been fortunate. I crossed 45 states for this job, and that's given me huge insights into America and what the power of the people are that live all across this country in many different circumstances. That only can come through, I think, travel.
And what about as leaders? What's something you actually implement? Maybe it's in your report or not, for your teams to help them maintain their sanity.
Well, I try not to be the 2 a.m. manager that I once was. I don't know if you understand that phrase, but when I meet with clients, one of the quickest ways I can get to the problem they need to have solved is I'll say, what wakes you up at 2 a.m.? And they almost all know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're leading a team, you have 2 a.m. moments. And if I can help them have a better night's sleep because I've solved their 2 a.m. problem, that's a good thing. But what I meant was I also don't want to approach any of my team in the middle of the night. Even though I have ideas, nobody likes to see an email that shows up at 2 a.m. It's not good for their mental state. It's not good for mine.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's just make extra effort to make myself available to people so they always know they can come in and have a question or talk about whatever they need to talk about. I guess that kind of also is making sure you have good communication.
And I'll just build on Andrew's. If people aren't using schedule send on email, almost every email provider now has that. And some people are like, oh, I'll send it now. It's 2 a.m., but they're not going to be checking their email, or it's the weekend, but they'll just check it on Monday. You never know when someone might wake up and get or how they have their alerts set. So take advantage of schedule send, please.
Yeah. Even though I wake up at 2 a.m. and I have all sorts of good ideas, I've tried to restrain myself.
I'm glad you did, Andrew. I'm glad you did.
Do you have any favorite time-saving hacks?
Yes, the word no.
Yeah, that works. When I've been out of the office on a trip or on vacation or something, I read my emails backwards. It saves a lot of time because problems get solved. And then you can read the history of how big a problem it was and how easy it was to solve. And then you don't have to deal with it.
And then I'm going to do a variation on what I typically ask for business organizational leaders is 5 years out, what does success look like? 5 years out, if we've really made a dent in the burnout problem, what do you hope to see in the industry?
Well, I'm hopeful that leadership will put this on the agenda not as something they do as a quarterly challenge, but as something they think of as a weekly opportunity. I've strongly suggested to the leaders that I work with, and there are many strong leaders that I get the pleasure of working with, that this topic is that important that it needs to be on their department head meeting schedule every week. If they're not at least talking about something, they should at least acknowledge what's been done to help address this issue. In other words, again, we're either getting better or we're getting worse. I always say solving this problem of burnout is like marriage. If you don't do anything, it will get worse. If you do a little something every day extra, it will get better.
Yeah. And I think obviously the goal is to have healthy newsrooms and have, more people that are interested in staying there and are feeling good about their jobs. And that would be terrific if we could report that in 5 years.
And then the last pair of questions are recommendations. So to bring some local specificity to the podcast, if someone is visiting where you live, what are 3 to 5 places or activities that you would recommend they take advantage of?
Well, I'll go first, I guess. Columbia, Missouri. Some of it's seasonal. In March, we have a documentary film festival called True False, which is brings in directors from all over the world, and it's really great because the directors answer questions about the movies that you get to see, so that's terrific. In the fall, SEC football game is always a treat, and our walking trails are terrific. They're all over the city, and they're very relaxing and beautiful to walk on.
And I'll offer a completely different perspective. I live in a little town south of Nashville, Tennessee called Franklin. I've lived a lot of places, 17, 18 places around the United States, and I've decided to live here. And one of the reasons is that it's got such a rich history. Many people have not heard of the Battle of Franklin, which occurred during the Civil War, but it was one of the most important battles that occurred there. So when I bring people here or when they visit me, I always make a point of taking them to the battlefield and a place called the Carton Plantation where the battle raged around, where 7 Confederate generals were laid out who died in that battle. It broke that part of the Confederacy. They were never able to successfully launch offenses after that particularly brutal battle. There's next to the plantation a cemetery. It's one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the United States. Over 1,000 men were buried there from all over the South. And it's a very sober experience to stand there and to think about the terrible losses that occurred. And we're talking thousands of people who died or were badly injured in this battle. It shows that, America has been through great trauma before, and hopefully we'll never have to endure something like that again, but that, good men were willing to fight for causes. And in the end, of course, the Union was reunited. And that happened in part because of what happened in this little town.
And then the final question, 3 to 5 pieces of media that you recommend, and this can be purely pleasure, entertainment, or news related, and it can be any form of media.
For a TV series, I like Slow Horses, that's about British spy service. I like Ezra Klein's podcasts. And I also like a newsletter called The Media Co-Pilot, which is by Pete Paschal. It's all about AI and the industry.
And I'll be a little more sober. I'll just tell a short story and then it'll lead to why I'm making these recommendations. We're living in dangerous times, challenging times, to put it mildly. And I was telling a friend of mine about some neighbors I had when I moved to an apartment complex in Des Plaines, Illinois, when I was a little kid. And off to the right were 2 elderly people from Germany who took me into their care. They became like surrogate grandparents to me. They were Jewish and they had tattoos on their arms. I don't think I need to explain further, but they were survivors of a concentration camp in Germany. And they taught me about hope and faith and belief in goodness even as a small child, they communicated that to me. They had survived the very worst of humanity, but they were still people who cared about their neighbors and their community. And they gave me a strong sense that good will win over evil if it's coming down to that. I know that sounds dramatic, but I'm thinking about that and those people a lot these days. And so I've been, rewatching some movies that sort of help me understand that. So if you haven't seen The Pianist, I strongly recommend it. It's just a beautifully done movie on so many levels. Life is Beautiful, a very different movie, tragic comedy, but conveys some truths that I think are important these days. You could watch Schindler's List. I think it's a powerful movie. As somebody who's a parent, you can't watch that movie without being horrified at times. Europa, a very different take that sort of guides you through the deceptions of humanity and what we will do to survive. And then I know it's going to sound strange to finish on it, and I certainly don't recommend it in the sense of it teaches you about the Holocaust, but it just puts a frame around what evil is, and that's downfall. I know it's parodied a lot, but that movie has some important reminders that ordinary people can become part of evil if they are not careful.
Well, thanks a lot for that and for your time. And hopefully this will help the report get further spread and people to really dig into solving the burnout problem.
Yeah, well, thank you for your interest in it. It truly is one of the issues that will determine whether or not journalism doesn't just survive, but thrives. Because if every journalist, in effect, becomes 30% less effective because of burnout factors, either their own issues or those of their colleagues, I think American democracy suffers as a result.
Yes, I agree. And thank you, Tim, for inviting us to give you an update.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.